Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. This tutorial is part of a beginner CSS series. I'll be using the Chrome web browser, the Visual Studio Code editor, and the live server extension for Visual Studio Code to view the web page. There are links to these tools, starter code files, and all resources in the description below. Let's move on to the CSS Box Model. Today you'll learn that everything in CSS is a box, but before we finish, I'll show you how to turn a box into a circle if you want to. So let's get started. On the left I have Visual Studio Code, and I have the code from the last tutorial. We'll modify that in just a second. On the right I have a basic web page, once again with an H1 header and a paragraph, and I'm using the live server extension, so any changes I make in the CSS and when I save the file will immediately show then in the web page. Okay, so everything we have over here except the H1 has got to go. So I'm going to delete everything above and below and leave the styles for the H1, and we can now save and we see those changes. So our paragraph text has gotten smaller and everything else is pretty much the same, except we do now have the default styles from the browser again, and we'll get back to that CSS Reset in just a bit. But right now we want to look at this box model, and we've already drawn a box by putting a border around our H1 element. We can see this border here defined with shorthand, and we'll get into what all of that means in just a second too. But what I want to do first is drag our Visual Studio Code over as far as I possibly can and give us some more room in the browser because we're going to open up DevTools. So once we do that, you can press Shift Alt, or I'm sorry, not Shift Alt, it is Control Shift, I believe, and the letter I to open DevTools. And if that's not working, then you should be able to, no, that is going to work. It just took a second here on my computer. And if that doesn't work, you could right click and choose Inspect as well. Once you have it open, you may not have your DevTools on the right, and if you don't, you can click the three dots and choose where it is docked. I like to have mine on the right. And then you can select any of the elements in the HTML here, and you see it flashing over on the web page because it highlights what element you've selected. And I am in the Elements tab that you can choose as well. After that, I am going to select that H1. So it's inside of our header element here. And after I select it, I've got H1. And notice the colors changed on the web page. This is already showing us the box model right here. So what we have for the orange is the margin. And then we can clearly see our border that we put in with 2 pixels, and it is dashed. And then inside of that we see green, and that is the padding. And then inside of that we see blue, and that's actually the content. And now if we go down here where we have a Styles tab, let's choose the Computed tab, and we actually see the box model inside of our DevTools. So we can highlight any aspect of this. So I'll go to the content first. And now we only see the blue highlighted on the web page, and that is our content, and it's showing us the actual size of the content in pixels here as well. And then we go to padding, which is the next layer. The padding is once again inside of the border, and it just wraps around our content. It gives some extra space inside of the border, gives our content a little room to breathe, if you will. So here you can see it's 24 pixels. Then we have our border, which it shows it as 1.993 pixels. We set it to 2 pixels. Hey, close enough, right? And after the border, we have margin. And you can see we didn't set a margin. So this margin is just showing the space that is left after our element is there. So on top, we have 32 pixels. And then we have 32 pixels on the bottom as well. And that's probably just because of the default of the H1. We didn't set a margin on the right, but we do see a big margin over there. And that's just because we have set that 50% width on our H1. So it's not taking up the full page space, and what's left is occupied by margin. So it's important that you remember how to get here in DevTools. We're on this Computed tab below, and you always want to be able to bring up the box model to see exactly what's going on with your elements. After that, it's also important to just memorize the different layers of the CSS box model. So starting on the inside, we have content, then we have padding, then we have border, and finally we have margin on the outside. And now concerning our H1 and the margin that I have highlighted, notice it's 32 pixels, actually 32.16 pixels. and we didn't set that. So that's a default style on the H1. We've got the H1 selected. Let's go back to the Styles tab instead of the Computed tab, and we can see this if we scroll just a little bit. There's the styles we set, and then here are the default styles from the browser. This is a user agent style sheet that's assigned by the browser, and here you can see they assigned some margin settings here. It's 0.67 EM. So that's essentially 2/3. Now, if we remember about our units, an EM responds to the font size of the element, and we set a font size of 3 rem, which would essentially be 48 pixels. So 2/3 of that is coming in right around where we see it on our box model here at 32.16 pixels. So now that we know our font size is impacting the default margin, let's go ahead and change our font size. And of course, it will also change our padding that we based on EM units. I'm going to change this to 2 rem, if I can type here, 2 rem, and save. And now things have changed. Notice our margin got smaller. It's 21.44 because our font size got smaller. And this is based on an EM unit, an M, as far as the browser is concerned. So once again, it's still 0.67 EM, but the actual size is smaller. It's 21.44 pixels. Now, changes like this can be really hard to keep track of. And so that's why sometimes we just want to reset the browser settings for all the margins and all the padding and just take control of them ourselves. And that's why we use a CSS reset. And a very basic CSS reset starts with the wildcard at the top, and then we set margin for all elements, because remember, this wildcard selects all elements. So we set the margin to 0, and we set the padding to 0, and we can save. And now all of that margin and padding that is set by default is taken away. And you can see the body actually had a little bit of margin set to it as well, because now we're right up to the edge of the body here on our page, and this border we set around our H1 is right up to the edge of the page as well. And there's one more setting I always put inside of the CSS reset, and that is box dash sizing. There we go. And now the default is content box. And if we save, we won't really notice a change here. It didn't really change anything because that is the default. So what the content box does is it says, okay, the size that we're setting is this for the content and the content only. It doesn't include calculating the size of the padding or of the border or of the margin at all. So instead of 50%, I'm going to set an absolute width on here so we can compare. And I'll set this to, say, 400 pixels and save. Now let's look over here in our box, and we can see the content is 400 pixels, but that doesn't account for the padding. What we have here is not the 400 pixels we were expecting. We took up more space than that. But if we set this to border box instead of content box, then we'll get what we expect, and it's much easier to calculate. So now notice our content over here is not 400 pixels, it's 348. And then we can add in 24 pixels of padding on each side and 2 pixels of border on each side, and then we can get our total of 400. So what border box does is it really helps us calculate the sizes that we are assigning, because it goes ahead and includes the border and the padding. It does not include the margin. The margin is on the outside of our CSS boxes that we create, whichever elements that we're styling. So the margin is not included in that calculation. However, the rest is. So the border and the padding and the content all add up to that 400 pixels that I set right here. Okay, now that we've broken down how the border box setting works and looked at the CSS box model, let's go ahead and close DevTools, and let's just style our page a little bit with some of these properties. I'm going to resize the page a little bit so we have some more room for Visual Studio Code over here on the left. I'll pull this over. There we go. And now let's make some changes. So one thing I have thought about is our H1 right here has some settings I normally probably wouldn't put on an H1. I'm just more concerned with the font there, but the font size that would be assigned by default is okay too. So I'm going to get rid of that. And now these other settings, I would actually be more likely to put on the container than I would on the H1 itself. And the H1 is inside of a header element, so let's go ahead and save that. And it changed just a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to change these EMs back to rems because now I'm not setting a font size on the header. So I'm going to use 1.5 rem here and save. And now we've got our padding back to about where it was. But now what if I wanted to assign these same settings to the container that our paragraph is in? And that's in the main element. So maybe I don't want this on the header. Maybe I want to assign a container class so I can provide these same settings for more than one container. So I'm going to quickly go over to the HTML. And in the HTML, we'll set a class called container on each of these elements. So we have the header element, and we'll set the class equal to container. And I've got one extra quote there. There we go. And now I'm just going to copy this and I'll paste it into our main element as well. And save that. And there we go. So now we've got dashes around both of these boxes here. Let's go back to the CSS and make these bigger so we can see them better on the page. Right now I'm going to get rid of this 100 pixel or 400 pixel width. Let's go ahead and let them take up the full 100% for now. Okay, let's go ahead and add a font size to the container, and it will apply to both of these differently, but we'll set it to 1.5 rem and save. Now our font's a little bit bigger, but notice how the edges of the border are right up against the page. So on the outside of our box, we can set a margin and also set that to 1.5 rem and save. And now we have our two boxes and the margin has pushed them away from the edge. The margin has also provided space between the two boxes here. And now that we have a font size on our container, we could go ahead and switch this back to EMs. And remember, one EM would be the same as the font size. So it would be equal to the 1.5 rem. So if we make this change, we just change it to 1M and our sizing should stay the same, and it does. If we change this to 1.5, it will get bigger. Yes, and now we have more padding. We could add more margin by doing the same if we want to, so let's go ahead and do that. And now let's go ahead and experiment with the margin and the padding because we don't have to have the same setting on the top, right, bottom, and left. And I did say that order specifically for a reason, because for the margin, we could just say margin top. And here, let's go ahead and say 1.5 EM and save. And look what happens to our other margins. The left and right margins are gone, and you can't really see that we lost the margin on the bottom, but we did. The only thing separating these containers now is the margin on the top. So now let's go ahead and add some margin on the right. And here we'll set this to 2 EM and save. So it's just a little bigger. And now we do have margin on the right, but still no margin on the bottom and no margin on the left. I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow. And now instead of the right, I'm going to switch this one to bottom and save. And now we have some more margin here on the bottom. So the separation between these two boxes got bigger. That's the only thing you could really see right there. And now on the right, let's go ahead and switch, on the left, let's go ahead and switch this to 2 EMs as well. And you can see we got the same thing as if we just said margin 2 EM, except we wanted a margin on top of 1.5 EM. So there is shorthand for this. So I'm going to comment all 4 of these out, and I'll press Shift, Alt, and the letter A to do that. There you can see a CSS comment, so it commented those out. So right now there will be no margin, once again. Now the boxes are next to each other, no margin on the left and right. But our shorthand is just saying margin. And when I say this, 1.5 EM, that applies it to top, bottom, left, and right. And it actually goes in the order top, right, bottom, left. So now we could put in different settings with this shorthand if we wanted to. So 1.5 on top, and then 2 M's on the right and the left, and then 2 M's on the bottom, and I can save. And that is the same thing as when we had all 4 of these right here. Now, if I just wanted to have 1.5 on the top and the bottom and 2 on the left and the right, I could delete this third setting right here And that's what we get. So now it will take 1.5 and apply it to the top and the bottom, and 2 and apply it to the right and the left. However, you can provide all 4 settings. So we could go 3 and 4, and then we would have the shorthand. Notice the left margin, the final value here, is much larger, twice as large actually as the right margin. And then the bottom is definitely larger than the top margin, because here you can see only the top margin as it applies to the first container. And now you can see the top margin and the bottom margin here combined to create the space between the 2 boxes. Now this same idea for shorthand also applies to padding. So I will copy these, actually cut them, and just go back to the 1 setting for margins. So that looks a little bit more normal again. But now let's apply this same thing to the padding and we'll see how that changes. So now we have a much larger left padding of 4, twice as much as we have on the right. And then we have a larger bottom than we do on top. This is easier to see because it's inside of our container. And remember, if you're ever having a hard time seeing all of this different white space, I guess I dragged Visual Studio Code. I meant to grab the edge of Chrome here. I'll pull this over, right click, choose Inspect, open up the Dev Tools again, and we can see all of this hidden white space much clearer when we look at the box model. So once again in Dev Tools, choosing the Computed tab, but we also need to highlight what we're going to look at. So I'm going to choose this main container, and now we can see the space as it's applied here. So here's the content, here's the padding, and see we have 48 pixels on the right, but 96 on the left, twice as much. We have 36 on top, but 72 on the bottom, which is twice as much also. So we can definitely see that our padding settings over here, once I drag this over, are being applied as we specified them in this shorthand. Okay, back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to resize Chrome once again so we can see our code better. Dragging this over, dragging Visual Studio Code back over here. There we go. And we can do the same thing you might expect with border. Actually, first worth discussing, you can just delete the 2 pixels, and then when we save, it actually gets a little thicker because the default is more like 3 pixels for the size here. I'm going to delete this odd sizing for the padding that I used just to indicate the different sides for the padding, and we'll go back to kind of a normal look here. We've got 2 containers and they have equal padding and equal margin around them. These settings also apply to the individual border sides, so that means we can say border-top, and here we could say 5 pixels solid, and then I'll go ahead and press Shift-Alt and the down arrow. And then instead of border top, I'll go ahead and say border right, and I'll say 10 pixels, and here I'll say dotted, and save. And now we can see we had some major changes here, and we didn't specify a color, so these settings were to override what we had set with shorthand above, and so the default color is black, but we have a dotted right and we have a solid top. So we could have specified different colors here as well. So we could say green, and then of course over here we could say something different like yellow, and save. And now, ooh, that is ugly. That definitely changed our borders though. So I'll switch that to blue and save our eyes just a little bit. And if we wanted to specify these individually, we could even say border top width, and then we wouldn't specify the solid or green here. So you can break out each individual setting as well. And so now you can see we just changed the width of the top one. Likewise, instead of width, there's also border top. Let me switch that. There we go. Style. And this is where we're specifying dotted or anything else. Here's ridge is another value. We'll save that. And so now the top is a little bit different. It looks pretty much like the solid setting does. And then of course there would be border top color. And we could turn this to any color we want. So I'll choose blue here as well. And now we have a dashed blue line across the top of our border. So many settings for the border when you break them out individually. We had border top, but then we also specified border top width, border top style, border top color. And then of course you can do that instead of for top, you could do right, bottom, and left as well. Often because of this, because there's so many, I'll delete this, I just use the shorthand. I usually want my borders to have the same width all the way around. So previously I'd had 2 pixels here, and then I chose dashed. Let's choose a different one here. Let's use outset, and we'll save. And we can see it changed our frame around the box. Another one that I like is called double. And I'll put a link to the border page from MDN in the description, and you can see all of the different values there. Let's make this larger so we can really see the double, what it does here. I'll save, and there you go. We've got our double lines now around each container. While we're covering border, one other setting to cover is outline. Outline is not part of the box model because the difference between it and the border is that it doesn't take up space. But you style outline much like you would the border. So here I'm going to choose 5 pixels, and I'll choose solid, and then let's make the outline a different color entirely. Let's go with purple. And if I save this, now we can see purple wrapping outside of our border. But again, the outline is not calculated because it doesn't take up space, so it's not calculated into that box model equation. Another property that the outline has that is very handy is outline-offset. So instead of being right up against our box, we can say we want the offset to be 5 pixels and save, and see how we pushed it now 5 pixels further out from our border. So it's offset 5 pixels from the rest of our box. And something worth considering sometimes is using a negative value. So if I put in negative 10 pixels, we'll now see the outline is inside of our box here. And so let's go ahead and change this some more so we get it a little further inside, maybe even 20 pixels, and save. And we can clearly see the outline is now inside of our box model. Okay, in the beginning, I promised to show how to turn a box into a circle before we were finished. So let's do that. I need to go back to the file tree and find our index.html and hide the file tree with Control B. And I just want to put a div down here. I'm going to keep it in the side of the main element, so I'll just type div, and then I want to give this div a class and set this equal to, there we go, to circle. I still didn't spell circle right. I'm having a rough time today. Save. There we've got a div with the class of circle. Okay, we can close the HTML, and now let's style our circle class. So we'll start with circle definition here for the class, and let's give the circle a background color of gold, but we haven't given it any size yet. So let's say a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. And that doesn't look like much of a circle yet, but it will. Let's go ahead and add a border now of 2 pixels. We'll make this solid black. And now we see our border applied to our square. And let's add an outline as well. Well, we need a new line for that outline. Now the outline can be 2 pixels, let's say solid, and let's go with red for now. So it'll match everything else a little bit and stand out. Now let's give it an offset also, and we'll make this 0.25 rem and save. So yeah, we've got just a little space there. Now let's create some separation from the other content, and so I'll just leave this at the top, but I'll make the margin 3 rem and save, and now it's pushed itself away. But something we didn't cover with the margin, if you set the margin, this doesn't work for top and bottom, but if you set it for left and right, notice we've got 3 rem for top and bottom now, we can use the keyword auto for left and right, and this will center it horizontally. That means in the middle, left and right. So now we put what will be a circle, our gold square, inside of our main element, and it's at the center horizontally, not vertically, but at least it is horizontally. And now to calculate our circle, we essentially just need to set one other border property, and we set it to half the value of the width and the height. So this border property is called border radius. I'll put it right under border. And we'll set it first, just so you can see how it works. Let's set it to 20 pixels, and you'll see what border radius does. Look how it rounded the corners of our square. So now we have more like a cool button, kind of like you would see there. And we can continue to round that. But if we set it to 50 pixels, which is half of the width and half of the height, and save, we've now got a circle. Now there's always more than one way to do things in CSS and typically in programming in general. So if you've got other ways you like to make circles in CSS, go ahead and leave those in the comments below. But I hope this has helped you learn about the box model today. So we have the content on the inside, then we have the padding, then we have the border, and finally on the outside we have the margin. And when we apply our basic CSS reset and we set the box siding to border box, the box sizing to border box, then the calculation includes the content, the padding, and the border instead of just the content. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.